Hello, bonjour, guten tag and all the rest, and welcome back to this week's Hearts for Dev Diary. Today we're going to be talking about Ethiopia Part 2, where we're discussing the alternative history branches for the Ethiopian focus tree, those mainly revolving around siding with Italy and going down a more communist path. Considering how Ethiopia is most likely the last country that you're going to see in terms of any new focus tree content, we can pretty much assume this is going to be the last meaty dev diary in terms of new focus tree content, so eat up what you can because this is it. But without further ado, let's see what we got this week. So the Hearts 4 team, following in the footsteps of New Blood, has a new dev diary written by AVB, somebody who hasn't written one before. Let's see what they've got in store. They describe that our Ethiopian situation remains the same, of course, no matter which way you're starting, with Italy impending their invasion and pretty much beginning some good headway into the country of Ethiopia. Your goal is going to be getting them out, one way or the other. This time we're talking about the other. In the historical path, we saw that Haile Selassie typically ended up capitulating and leaving the country to get the League of Nations to rally support around him to stop the illegal invasion. But this dev diary contends that there were other people inside Ethiopia who were just as willing to contribute ideas on how to end the war. With that, we get to have a quick look at what this focus tree 2 branches are going to be. We have the reach out to the Italian branch on the left, talking about trying to work our way into the Italians with a more fash route on the side, and our more communist branch, military communism, on the right, with 2 separate branches to go down, one with the Soviets and one less so with the Soviets. So the first path we're going to be discussing is the fascist path regarding the sympathising aristocrats who doubted Haile Selassie's methods of holding out to the utmost and instead maybe thinking that compromise would be the best way forward. Their focus therefore begins with reach out to the Italians. The content of the focus is about deciding who is going to take control of the nation after Haile Selassie has been sidelined. The icon shows the 3 different people that you can get. Haile Selassie Gugsa, Haile Tekle Himenot of Godjam, and Abba Jofir of Jimma. Certainly I've said all of those names correctly, right? Before going any further, I feel I have to address how the idea that instead of having focuses that are just generally achieving one thing, but instead having focuses that give you choices is so good to see. And one really good mechanic we've seen going forward is these options to choose which leaders you want. We saw it with the Soviet tree, with all of the different leaders. The Mexico tree is famous for giving you tons of different leader options, regardless of ideology. So yeah, I'm really happy to see this. But regardless, coming from the actual focus itself is titled Reach Out to the Italians, meaning you are going to be dependent on the Italian response to whether or not you can go down this focus tree path. If the Italians rebuke you, you're going back to the historical path of rallying around the emperor, but if they accept you, you can at least go down this choice. Whether or not the Italians accept you going down this path is going to be weighted specifically, but there could be alternative things, but specifically in regards to how much war escalation there is and how hard it is for the Italians to capitulate you. So if you're in a real stalemate situation, they haven't really got many Ethiopian states, or the war escalation has just gone on too long, they're more likely to have a compromise and accept you reaching out to them. But if the war's quite early on, or they're making good gains, or you're close to capitulation, then they're less likely to accept. Since we're talking about alternative history though, we're going to assume that the Italians did accept, and that begins the first 2 focuses you get to decide down this path: sway the warlords or expand the bodyguards. Swaying the warlords will boost popularity of fascism in Ethiopia because, well, you're trying to sway them to the sides of the Italian peace, and meanwhile expanding the bodyguards will guarantee a number of elite divisions. That should probably help once you get your side going. But once all is said and done, you can declare for Italy, which transforms what was traditionally a simple 1v1 war of colonialism into something of the Spanish Civil War magnitude. So I think what we see in this image is Italy, which has worked alongside Godjam, I think I'm saying that strangely, but there we go, who have now become, let's say, a puppet of Italy. The Sultanate of Ossa has decided not to work with Ethiopia, but doesn't necessarily look like they're working with Italy, while Ethiopia stands alone. Goodness me. Assuming you win that civil war in all the chaos that should happen, you probably will, considering you have the help of the Italian army. You will have to renounce Haile Selassie and get Victor Emmanuel I as your new emperor, with whoever you picked as your leader becoming the acting regent of the land. In this sense, the tree just follows down in sort of how traditional old school trees would follow down, with a transition of power and sort of just building up the country in a straightforward path. We can see replace the Abuna, where you replace the leader of the Ethiopian Coptic Church to somebody more Italian and loyal to the order. Invite Italian settlers. All this is shown here to just build up more support towards Italy. The victory parade is basically a parade held in Ethiopia to celebrate the victory you just got after defeating the old Ethiopian regime, and gives you a little spirit of the tainted Ra, with a minor stability boost. Nothing amazing here, but simple stuff. And on the left we have invite Italian settlers, which to me is quite interesting, where you're bringing in some Europeans to help with the reconstruction and just building up the country far better, which gives you the Italian settlers idea, giving you monthly population boost and construction speed boost. But more interesting to me than that, 2 own states in Ethiopia will gain Italian settlers, upgrading them from rural or pastoral and giving them new building slots. So it's kind of cool that you can actually transform the country into a much more developed country now. I feel like if they ever got round to doing the Middle East and South America, these kind of focuses are really the way to go. I'm thinking especially in regards to like Colombia and Venezuela and Peru, who are quite rural and not too developed, especially away from the coast, but with a bit more industrialization, I could imagine they could be upgraded. After following your key focus train all the way down, we arrive at what I think is the first key choice that you're going to get ever since picking the original focus, and that's going to be whether or not you're going to stay as a loyal subject of Italy or you're going to go for a restoration of independence. This is going to be like, I guess, Manchukuo, or maybe like Poland if you go down the Fash path and you become a German puppet and you get to decide whether you're going to stay a puppet or go your own way. If we choose to go down the path of remaining the puppet of Italy, we get Amadeo's Feast of Mascal, something that actually did happen historically, but in this alternative timeline is being used as a celebration as the Ethiopian nation deciding that subjugation under Italy is acceptable, which is going to give you some better buffs, and the Victor Emmanuel, the Emperor of Ethiopia, is not going to be a negative idea, but start to become slightly more accepted and more positive. From this point on, things are going to be pretty much as you might expect. You're going to be using the Italians to boost your industry, adopting the lira, which I think is funny, and inviting some general staff to help build up your army and get some Italian equipment, which will probably put you a little bit in debt to them. At the bottom of that, we have outsourced production, which will give you access to army and air force designers from the Italians themselves. The final part of the focus tree in this section of collaboration is going to be about really buffing up your final self, so making sure the Italian language is center is going to help Victor Emmanuel get his national spirit greater, and compensation allows you to ask for the parts of East Africa that you didn't have prior. I think it's interesting that we see this picture now, because this shows then that if you do go down this branch, you don't necessarily get all of Ethiopia, you just get the bit that you started with in that civil war, and Italy's going to take the rest. Also, side note, French Djibouti is owned by Gojam. I'm not sure if that's intentional, or if that's implying something, but I'm just going to ignore it and assume that that's something to be ignored, and French Djibouti is not randomly going to be owned by you for no reason. This final focus of the cooperation branch is the Italo-Ethiopian Empire, which tries to push you towards becoming a partner of Italy rather than just a colony. Similar, I guess, to how Manchukuo wanted to have the 2 emperors, one of China and one of Japan, and trying to make it much more, one for one. With this focus, you're going to get cores on claimed territory around the Italian-Ethiopian Empire, French Somaliland, and Yemen. And we also see how, with the new peace conference system, we see bid cost multiplied by 0.85. So not only is this just going to be about getting claims now, but making sure that you get them in peace conferences is kind of important. I do wonder if they're going to go back to old focus trees and make sure that focuses that need territory are going to get them. Possibly not, but it's something to bear in mind. Now we reach the other side. What if you don't want to be collaborationist? What if you want to go your own way and work from within for independence, with the Negus of Shua focus? If we saw in the previous branch with collaborationist, the focuses kind of buffed Victor Emmanuel to become positive, then in this branch he gets debuffed to become more and more of a negative. This is to reflect people not really accepting him as their true sovereign. With all that being said, you're basically going to be working up to having another war with Italy, underground war games, contacting exiles who obviously ran away from the new regime, and building up the underground state. There's also the focus, set up a customs barrier which makes trading with Italy even more difficult, and contact the exiles directly is trying to bring in foreign weapons for troops. Together for victory. Now that sounds mighty familiar. Because this branch basically revolves you playing as an underground state, you're not really going to have too many options to have massive industrial programs, so you're mainly going to be relying on asking foreign nations to help you, as we see here with our enemy's enemy, asking the UK, the Soviet Union, France, and I guess the other nation could be the United States, to give you some help. Another way you could try and get some equipment instead of asking for it is straight up stealing it from your Italian overlords. Although is it stealing if they technically stole your land? So I guess it's kind of a weird recompense. I don't know. Anyway, so you've got raid Italian depots, and as we see from this image, the Italian depots can be raided for 1,000 guns, which is the same amount you get as if you ask for them. Finally, we see Together for Victory allows you to ask various resistance groups in East Africa to come help you in your struggle, before eventually you launch your civil war. I think the idea is that you really want to make sure that the Italians are as weak as possible, probably like maybe losing to a European conflict, or at least just very preoccupied with it, so that hopefully they don't have a massive response to what you're doing. Assuming that they are too busy, the next focus after that can be Reclaim the Empire, which is going to give you options to regain cores on the territory that you gave to Italy in the War of Colonialism. With that, you reach the final part of this tree. Consolidate East Africa, giving you claims on Sudan, Somali Sultanate, Eritrea, Djibouti, Kenya and Uganda. We love Kenya and Uganda, which should give you some nice areas to core if you get them under your control. I guess what I'm more so disappointed about is if you're working alongside the, let's say, the allies to undermine Italy by removing one of their colonies, could you not maybe ask the British that, like, we're going to help you more if you can give us some of this territory, like Kenya, and then at least you'll have some of it, because otherwise you're basically going to have to go it alone. Right, enough about monarchism. Let's talk about communism, which is the other alternative history branch you can go down, and it begins with military communism, rallying the troops on the front line and thinking about what instead they could be doing to try and beat back the Italians. So I think the inspiration for this branch is mainly going to be about the kind of communist regimes that occurred after World War II, heading into the Cold War, around the kind of rapid decolonization we saw with places like Britain and France, and the sudden influx of new governments that might have taken a more communist approach. Similar to the collaborationist path, we start off with kind of a pretty much railroaded choice. You can either pick defending our home, giving you some defensive bonuses on your cause, and anti-imperialist agitation, giving you more communist support and trying to build up towards becoming a communist nation. Since you're going towards a military communist coup as opposed to sort of a public one, you only need some people to be on your side. So in order to become communist, you just need 20 support for communism. Then the military will use that as justification and get going with your coup against Haile Selassie. So, the Black Lions, who are going to be the people leading this communist military revolution, are effectively made up of the military. It is in the best interests of Haile Selassie to work with the army, because it's the army who are currently helping him defend against the Italians. So, in this sense, you're not going to be having a civil war, but more so an agreement that you're both going to have to work together, because Haile Selassie needs the army. Once you've got yourself in power, You now have the most classic choice in the world to make. Do you go communism alone, or do you go Soviet communism? Unlike in other branches though, I do feel like the having to pick between going your own path or going with the Soviets is actually a really relevant choice, because at the end of the day, instead of just going with the Soviets because that's the only communist mega faction you can join, it really does feel like the Soviets have the only proper army that can truly do any help. I mean, with access through Ukraine, through the Black Sea, through Turkey, they could relatively get there. It's not unthinkable, and they could come help. So asking the Soviets does seem like one of the most logical things you could do. Since the military communists believe that their only true hope is in the Soviet Union, let's start by talking about the Soviet aid. This will come with some Soviet divisions, as is expected, and is probably going to be a massive help. I mean, if we see in the Spanish Civil War, those Soviet tanks can be really deadly, and the mountaineers. So I can imagine some mountaineers in Ethiopia can do awful things. But that being said, they're going to be sending over some troops which are going to be helpful. After you've asked for guns, asked for generals, asked for help clearing the skies or dealing with the tanks, you arrive at the bottom with the Soviet mediation. Since this war is possibly going nowhere, you're going to have to ask the Soviets to help you end the war for you. With this, the Soviet Union will demand Italy to withdraw to the pre-war borders, with them still owning Somalia and Eritrea, but you do get to keep your stuff. Whether or not the Italians decide to accept this is a win-win. If they do accept it, well, you've just won the Italian-Ethiopian war. If they don't accept it, you get to keep fighting, but this time with the Soviets helping you, which is definitely a plus. And alas, there is of course the blood price to play. If you're going to have to work with the Italians in the fascist branch, you're going to have to become a puppet in the communist branch too. That's what you get for asking Stalin for help. Now we arrive at the post-war tree, assuming you've won, in which you get to choose where you're going forward. Similar to the Italian tree, you get to ask the Soviets to have access to some of their factories and design companies, but instead you also have the focus send home advisors. This will allow you to reject all the buffs that come with being a puppet of a major nation, but allow you to start heavily working towards becoming independent. On the right, we also see Bring the Revolution to the Afar, which allows you to try and liberate the people of Afar and Djibouti. I guess this focus tree has good heavy focus on getting to Djibouti. We demand it. Moving on, we see our own path, which allows you to declare independence once again, and see how well that goes for you, as well as Freedom at Gunpoint, which allows you to try and liberate East African nations. It's here we see actually one of the things I really wanted to see in these focus trees. It's funny that I talked about it earlier, and we do see a kind of version of it here, and that is that when you have this option to go to war with majors like Great Britain and France, you're often fighting over things that probably shouldn't matter to them during World War II. And that's why we see this decision offer peace for Sudanese independence, where if you do own the territory, you can ask them if they cede the territory to you and you become peace with one another. This is the kind of thing I was really hoping for earlier in regards to Britain, in which you could perhaps offer them like, I will never join the Axis, or I will embargo all Axis members in exchange for British Somaliland. But if you don't have that, you can of course just use the liberate buttons to liberate them individually in your great conquest of Africa. So, we've talked about what happens if you go with the Soviets, but what happens if you go with the not interested in the Soviets, Black Lions? So the Black Lions are currently back in the Civil War, rewinding time, and your first two focuses are going to be asking people to come in who are not Soviets, but do have communist ideals. Call Out to the World focus will give you people such as Emma Goldman, an international anarchist, but you also have the Japanese anarcho-communism, which will give you access to two anarcho-communists, Sakataru and Sanshiro, although it is said that these two people do not like each other, so they are mutually exclusive. Following on from that, you'll then have a mutually exclusive decision whether you're going to choose between international brigades, which should give you, I think, some weekly manpower and war support, or the People's Army, which will reform the military and remove the negative debuffs you have for high command and penalties. And in this photo we see the results of such a thing, with the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and all of the little support divisions they have in Addis Ababa to try and hold the line. It does look at this point though that it is a ceasefire, right? Like, these two nations are not attacking each other. So it does look like there could be the options to just call a truce. They'll hold what territory they can, and you're going to be living in this little western outhold. Because of this, we move down to focuses like African Wildfire, which are going to be about trying to cause chaos inside the territory that they currently hold over you. With the peace now settling in, you are going to have to start deciding what kind of country you want to build. We see this with a mutually exclusive local committees or a guiding hand. Do you want to decentralize and become an anarcho-communist federation, or do you want to try and create a traditional government like a communist republic kind of thing? As you work down, you're going to eventually start heading towards African Wildfire, where you're trying to really burn the Italian oppressors, holding your territory in their colonial grip, making it much harder for them to gain things and boosting resistance and autonomy gain in those places. Of course, it's not just Italy you can do this to, and we see in the anti-colonial decisions, you can also do it in Britain, French, Belgium, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, basically pretty much everybody who has territory in Africa who probably shouldn't. You also have support South African independence as a choice too. Whether or not they keep apartheid though, I don't know about that one. And with that, we reach the final part of this dev diary, the African Union. Both the anarchist and the Soviet sub-branch do have the option to lead to the focus the Organisation of African Unity. This is an organisation which was established in 1963 with headquarters in Addis Ababa to discuss the concept of unifying Africa into one entity which can withstand the pressure of outstanding unions. Pan-Africanism is actually something I looked into when I myself was suggesting possible formable nations. I did have East Africa as one, an East African Federation, which was another proposed federation with Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania, which had considered expanding to places like South Sudan. But yeah, definitely interesting that one of them did make it into the game. But enough about that. So we can see that you will unlock decisions to invite independent African countries to the Organisation of African Unity, with the sole goal of one day trying to unify all of it in one single African Union. For 25 PP, we can see that we can invite Liberia to the organisation. I'm not sure if they'll accept. And goodness me, look at that. So many nations popping up out of nowhere. Oof. Moving on down from that, we see that there's the African Central Bank, which gives economic boost to members who joined the institution, and mutual defence agreements, so that member states can also join that and get some buffs. It's interesting as well that they describe that the mutual defence is actually going to be more interesting because nations that join get to decide how much they want to join. So they can have full-blown membership or only have to join when a member state is attacked. So defensive wars are okay, but aggressive wars they don't have to join. Very interesting, unique stuff here. A lot of thought has been put into this. I like this. Once all that's been done, you can start building up to the African Union, where Ethiopia will become, as they say, the heart of the African Union with a beautiful new flag and its ability to core all the territory of the African Unity member states. It's also important to note that because these nations are being released and then called later, they have the option to do their individual industry trees before you call them. So they're not just barren wastelands necessarily, but they could have like a couple of civs, maybe a mill in there, maybe 3 dockyards if they took the naval focus. Really something to consider. And with that, that reaches the end of the focus tree with that shot of the African Union. It's a shame we didn't get to see a completely filled up African Union with every state taken up. 'Tis a great shame, but still really interesting stuff. All in all, I think it's important to remember as a first thing that Ethiopia is not exactly a major nation to World War II, right? It's important that it was defeated. It's not important that it grows strong, so we shouldn't expect something of the size of the Soviet Union for a focus tree. I think that the Soviet branch, or the Communist branch I should say, is pretty good, especially with the African Union. But I do feel like I'm slightly disappointed there's not more of a dramatic split-off moment, especially in the fascist branch, to do anything interesting beyond building the empire. For example, there's always a discussion of Ethiopia annexing Yemen, which I think is cool, but why isn't there also a potential to maybe go further and go into like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and trying to control that region, specifically maybe with the end goal of fully controlling the Red Sea, so you can make sure nobody can come near your capital and ports, as kind of a proactive defensive measure, eventually leading to you holding the Suez and making sure that the Suez is holding the line against more colonial action in Africa. I don't know, that was just a thought I had about what could have been a shift, as it's one of the few places that I feel like Ethiopia has access to invading, and it doesn't really utilise that ability too much. But alas, tell me what you think, and thank you very much for watching. I will, of course, read comments, and if you liked, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe. You're cool, you're awesome, and yeah. What did they do with Haile Selassie when he was gone? Does he become an advisor? Does he become a soldier? Does he just go to London and retire? It'd be cool if he became a British advisor or something, as like he gets kicked out, so he goes to Britain and just becomes like a nice advisor there. I don't know. Bye.